Good evening to everyone. I'd like to first begin by thanking all of the sponsoring student and community groups that put this forum together. I think it's very important that we celebrate history from the perspective of people who made it. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was part of a social movement that was created on the campus of the University of Washington. Beginning, as our moderator has indicated, in the late 1960s, that brought about a lot of profound changes on the campus and in the community, at least for a while. And during the few minutes that I have, though, I'm just going to focus my comments on the creation of the Black Student Union, but I need to do that because I think you all will better appreciate our rise by understanding a quote that I want to share with you from Margaret Mead, the famous U.S. anthropologist who studied people, human beings all over the world. Samoa, Africa, she lived nearly everywhere and wrote. But she talked about what kind of she once wrote an article on what kind of organizations usually bring about the most significant change. And she said the following: to the extent that there's been any meaningful social change in our world community, it has been organized by a small, committed, disciplined group that was able to focus on what it is they wanted to change. Their vision, created a vision, an articulate vision, stuck to it, and then worked collectively together and was willing to make whatever sacrifices necessary and do whatever is necessary, or as Malcolm X once said, use any means necessary to bring about that change. And only in that kind of context was change ever brought about. Therefore, I'd like to talk to you about the creation of the Black Student Union. On January 6, 1968, 13 students on the University of Washington campus, Black students, announced in front of the hub that we had just created the Black Student Union and that we were going to create Black Power on this campus. And that we were going to do it because we were young and we were fond of using, cliches. And we said that we're going to do it by any means necessary. We quoted Malcolm X, and we said this campus is going to change. Why did we organize the Black Student Union? Here was our analysis when we organized. The University of Washington had 32,500 students in 1968, only 63 of whom were African Americans. The University of Washington had 32,500 students, only 4 of them were Latino. We had 32,500 students, only 2 of them were Native Americans, both women on our entire campus. Both of the Indian sisters, Carmen and the other sister, I can't remember her name, we allowed to join the Black Student Union, and 1 of the 4 Latinos on the campus joined the Black Student Union because this was the only third world people's organization that had been begun, and we welcomed our third world brothers and sisters in. I think we're the only Black Student Union on the West Coast that ever had non-Black members. And we noted that of the 1,800 faculty in the Arts and Humanities department, that there were only 2 African American professors, and no Latino and no natives. We also noted that of the 3,200 classes offered, there was not 1 book used or written by an African American, Latino, Asian, or Native American person, nor was there even 1 article that used as its primary subject matter the history and contributions of non-white people in this nation or in the world community. So we said that the University of Washington is institutionally racist and it must change. And by February, we had 5 basic demands. They were the recruiting of more Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, and poor white students to the University of Washington. These were the demands that we submitted to Dr. Charles Odegaard, the then president. We had class consciousness. We felt that poor whites ought to be able to come to this campus too. Secondly, that the University of Washington institute a Black Studies program to begin to change the curriculum. 3, that the University of Washington hire more African American staff persons on the campus as administrators and counselors and professors. And 4, that the Black Student Union be represented in every leadership body on the campus, from student advisory to the daily, all the way up to the board of trustees. Those are our basic demands. And after just a 5-month struggle by this group of 13 students out of 32,000, or 13 out of 63, being diligent, focused, and disciplined, like Margaret Mead talked about, we were successful at getting the University of Washington president to sign off on our basic demands. And what that resulted in is that very fall, that very fall, the university created a Black Studies program. We had about 4 or 5 classes that fall. That very fall, we doubled the Black student population. 122 Black students came to the University of Washington from May 19th to September 3rd, and student acceptance had stopped in February. That was the power that we were able to create, where we got that change. We quadrupled the number of Latino students and increased by 10-fold the number of Native American students on the University of Washington campus. So we created a little prairie fire that brought about change. What I want to say during the 3 or 4 minutes that I have left is that although we made headway, we created a power base on this campus. Being a student is just a transitory period. Unfortunately, I think one of our weaknesses is that we didn't spend very much time, and we weren't that successful at developing 2nd and 3rd level leadership. And I think the heyday of the Black Student Union was 1968 to 75. In 1975, there was about 1,600 Black students on the campus. After that year, it began to go down very gradually, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that we didn't keep a vigilant base of Black and other third world students on the campus, even though throughout all these years we continued to have BSU, METRA, and other organizations that were militant, that represented the students. Finally, we worked closely with progressive white groups. We believed in working with the Student for a Democratic Society, SDS. We believed by 1970, the focus of this celebration tonight, we worked very closely that year with the Seattle Liberation Front and the other progressives, socialist or left organizations that were on campus, and we led that 15,000 person march from the University of Washington down to the mayor's office in May of '70 after the killings at Jackson State and Kent State. I know that organized students focus on something that relevantly needs to be changed can make a difference. I look forward to talking to you all later about that. Thank you.
Also, I want to thank Jesse and his other comrades that organized this event, and all the other student organizations that have participated, and also for the this work that has been done on this project here. And I think, you know, that's really one of our jobs that we have to do, is pass on the history of our predecessors. And that is how we, my generation, realized that we had to be involved in the struggle for social justice, because we came from a tradition of oral tradition. And we were very close to many of the tragedies that happened to African American people and other people of color, starting with slavery on up till the time that we began to get active. So it definitely would be easy to say that the University of Washington and the universities throughout the nation were launching pads for the movements of the 60s. And as Larry mentioned, that the 13 members of the BSU, was I one of those? Okay. I had to ask Larry to make sure. It's a long time ago. So I remember that. I remember sitting in the hub and walking into the hub and seeing everybody sitting in the same spot every day and having very spirited discussions. And the Vietnam War and many other things were going on around us. And we wanted to make this campus a place for everyone. And at that time, it was not a place for everyone. There were, as Larry said, there were only a small number of students of color here on this campus. So we wanted to change that. And we began to do a lot of work on campus and working and organizing with a lot of other people and began to make this movement happen. We also realized that we had to start doing organizing in the community. And one of the things that we did was organize the first black student union, high school black student union on the West Coast, and that was at Garfield High School. And then we turned our attention to Franklin High School because we looked at Franklin High School as a school that had 60% minorities and had there was only one teacher of color on the campus at Franklin High School, and that was it. So an incident occurred where there was a black student that had been kicked out of school for fighting, and the white student that he got in a fight with remained in school. And so we decided that this was our opportunity to look at Franklin and see if we could make some changes happen. So there were about, I remember that it was a rainy day, it was about maybe 30 of us from the university and students from Garfield and some of the students from Franklin that we formed at the little small sandwich shop right across the street from Franklin High School. And we began to march into the school, and we marched into the principal's office. And while we were marching, as Larry said, we really like slogans. So we were saying our slogans, our slogans as we marched in. And I'm sure the secretary and the other people in the office were like, what's going on? What is this invading our office? But we were really determined. We were not going to be deterred from anything that we set out to do because, as I said, we had the history of our ancestors, the history of our parents were really literally pushing us forward. And so the principal refused to meet with us, so we just went on into his office anyway. All 30 of us jammed into his office, shouting Ungawa, Black Power, and many other slogans. And so he just got up and left and told all his staff to leave campus. And for us, that was a victory because we had the school to ourselves. We corralled all the students into the auditorium, and we held a rally right there in the school. So that was a very powerful moment, and that was a early victory for us. So really, and pushed us forward and really lifted our spirits, and we really felt like, yeah, we can make some things happen. So we began to turn our attention on the campus. But I only have a few minutes left, so many of us were this was a progression for us. We went from being involved in the BSU to being involved in SNCC and eventually we formed the first Black Panther Party chapter here in Seattle. And it was actually 25 students from the University of Washington that drove down to Oakland, to San Francisco, to the first Black Student Union Conference, second Black Student Union Conference on the West Coast at San Francisco State. We rented cars. The school allowed us to rent cars. We disconnected the mileage gauge so we wouldn't get charged for the mileage, and we all piled in 5 different cars and drove down there. And you know, a week later we had the Black Panther Party started here and in Seattle, and we had many students. You know, Larry talked about the tremendous influx of Black students that came in to the campus because of the work that we had done, and we recruited a lot of those people into the Black Panther Party. We had so many party members here, we used to call Lander Hall Panther Hall. So I'm going to end my conversation, and hopefully we can have some questions and we can talk a little bit more. And thanks again.
Okay, I have to have my notes and my watch and my water and everything within easy reach. So I'm going to tell you sort of my personal story with some, you know, some real history. Real history thrown in. How's that? So, and if anybody knows anything that I don't remember, please just shout it out. I mean, only if it's clear that I don't remember it. So I want to tell you how I first became involved in SDS. I was sophomore or junior at the University of Texas, and this was not long after the Berkeley free speech movement, so it was pretty early. And the big activity of SDS at the time was something that we called Gentle Thursdays, where we would draw chalk drawings on the sidewalks and put nickels in expired parking meters. So if you contrast this with, you know, the way SDS ended up, you know, you can imagine the range of where SDS went. So I know people tend to think of the last violent days, but just remember Gentle Thursdays. But even then, there was nothing particularly gentle about the way women were treated. Women were expected to do the mimeographing, to do the fetching and carrying, and to sleep with the men. So if you think the make love, not war was just an abstract notion, no. The men were not supposed to make war, and we were supposed to make love to them, sort of in return, I guess. But now I do remember that my very first speech at an SDS meeting, and actually anywhere that I had ever made in my whole life, was in impassioned ire toward a male member of SDS who had just been talking about, I don't know, something, and I just got up and I railed at him about, you know, what did his wife do at home, and, you know, did he do any of the housework, and, you know, and I just went off on him, but those were new ideas at the time. And so I was prescient, I would say, in my ire. So let me come forward now to when I came to Seattle. By the late 60s, the women's movement, various heads of it were raising themselves from the people who were picketing the Miss America campaigns, and, you know, bra burning was not a big thing, but it is what sticks in people's minds. To women who really focused on women's issues in a more fundamental way, and then to those of us who stayed in the anti-war movement, still trying to get beyond make love, not war. And I was one of them. So I will tell you how things went. We continued to make love. I'm getting off on this, aren't I? Not in that sense. I mean, off track. SDS began to disintegrate in the summer of 1969 with the splintering of the Weathermen, the what was known as RIM 2. Don't even ask me about that. It's too hard to explain. And the Progressive Labor Party. So it all disintegrated all at once, although it took time across the country to fully disintegrate. By the time it disintegrated here, it was replaced, or arose in its place, was the Seattle Liberation Front. Seattle Liberation Front was divided into collectives. I was a member of the East is Red, the West is Dead collective. From that you can but there were two collectives whose women basically left or kicked the men out, or whichever way you want to look at it. It was the East is Red, West is Red, the East is Red, West is Dead collective, and the Sundance collective. We were both pretty prominent, although small scale, in our time. But after I believe it was the last Sky River Rock Festival, women came back from the Rock Festival and began to call my house the center of the Anna Louise Strong Brigade. And I cannot remember the other women's.
Van Shen.
Van Shen, yes.
Red Avengers.
The Red Avengers. Okay. Thanks. Does that mean 5 minutes gone?
No.
Oh, good.
That's all you got.
All right, I got to rush. All right, so anyhow, women called both houses. We got together. Those women were coming back from Sky River Rock Festival with reports of having been raped. So we got on our high horses, and rightly so, and we went to a meeting and blasted Seattle Liberation Front out of the water. So that was the end of them. So there. Now, I want to then, of course, we were out of, I mean, there was no more men's anti-war movement. We told the men to go find their own paths to follow, their own, what is it? What's the word you want? Yeah, what is the word I want? Anyhow, and they did. It was sort of like, leave us alone and go do your own thing, which, of course, we took from the SNCC days. But what we did was we began to work for providing services to women. And the Anna Louise Strong sponsored a day-long deal called Survival Revival. And out of that and other activities grew women's health issues. A radio women's health clinic, which I don't know if it's still going, but that was a direct outgrowth of that. Women in the Trades, an organization called Mechanica, sprung from that. Seattle Rape Relief sprung from that. The Feminist Karate Union sprung from that. In 1972, which is all this around the same time, the same couple of years, 1972, the first women broke into, in a figurative sense, UW Law School. Now, if you can imagine, when you look at law schools today and attorneys, the whole population of attorneys, and even the coming makeup of the Supreme Court, that we definitely took that one by storm. In the early days of rape crisis centers, they were, their purpose was to protect victims from the police, and now their purpose is to counsel victims, to provide mental health services. When I started the Feminist Karate Union, it was very much building something that was for women, taught by women, because I had always been the only woman in my class, in my karate class. Then, after Ted Bundy did his thing around here, I was swamped with women wanting self-defense training and karate training. And that brought me around to really focusing on self-defense. Now, Feminist Karate Union, which is still going on without me, has gone back to a traditional karate school, and self-defense is being handled by other people, although I have retired. So that's pretty much all I want to say, except to point out that one of the failings of the women's movement was that we were never able, in my day, to go beyond being an all-white movement. And part of what I believe was going on there, that I heard from women of color, was that they felt this tremendous tension between, I think what you heard from Ms. Alumni there, you know, are we women of color first, or are we women first, are we people of color or women? And that was a tension that was very difficult to deal with, whereas because my part of the women's movement was coming out of this white, middle-class, university-based anti-war movement, we didn't have that problem, and it was really easy for us to just go toe-to-toe with the men of the anti-war movement, and I'm glad that we did, although I have some regrets along the way. But there, how'd I do on time? I can wrap it up. All right, let me see, what did I leave out? Oh, I know. One of the things I have to leave out is that I was not a part of, but there was a women's liberation organization that sort of bridged before the women from SDS and after the women from SDS, and they did the most fantastic job of community organizing that I have ever heard of before or since. They did an initiative campaign for abortion rights that was not your Iman kind of initiative campaign. These women went throughout the state of Washington, including all over Eastern Washington, knocked on doors, talked to people about the issues, collected names. It went on the ballot, and we have abortion rights. We had abortion rights in this state before Roe v. Wade because of those people.
I was not one of the media stars of SDS. I like to do the posters and things behind the scenes, write the flyers, the newsletter, whatever. But what I'd like to do is give just a short personal history of what brought me here, and then maybe explain some of the differences between now and then, because whenever I describe stories from that time, people will say, wow, I wish we could do that now. And I don't think people have a clear understanding of why it's different now, or what things are the same and what things are different. One of the things, for instance, that's the same is the University of Washington. It's still a corporate university. The Board of Regents is still a corporate board. It does the same, you know, it's in bed with the Defense Department. It does the sweatshop labor thing. I mean, you name it, across the board, you all know what it does, and it's been doing forever. It made a few concessions for us when we forced them, but pretty much the same institution it's always been. I went to high school at Bellingham High. It was a town then of 35,000 or so. a small town high school, really. We were maybe 6 of us were against the war in Vietnam. At that time, I graduated in '65. And so for solidarity, we would go up to Western Washington, where there was a Friends of SNCC chapter, and they had parties, fundraising parties supposedly, but they sold booze for, oh no, it was 50 cents to get in and all you could drink. I don't understand how they made any money.
Donations.
But I was very much inspired by the civil rights movement. I had some friends that went south for the freedom rides and so forth, and I passed around the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party petition to seat the alternative delegation at the Democratic National Convention. I didn't get very many signatures, but I had lots of interesting conversations. So just as a background, so coming to the University District in 1965 to attend the University of Washington was a huge eye-opener for me. It was like all of a sudden my community increased from 6 people to thousands. It was astounding, it was wonderful, and I think in a way that's sort of the difference between then and now, because we were a community on campus and off, and you saw people like myself. I was a student one quarter and the next quarter not, but it didn't make any difference. You were part of the community, you went to the meetings, you did the organizing, whether you were actually going to class or not going to class, and you were building a community, and that community existed in time and space, and it existed here at the University of Washington. We felt we were taking over the university, we were making it us. I was in SDS. SDS was at that time, well, as Pi said, it started out, I think the first year I was here, I didn't do much with SDS. They were passing out lollipops on Thursdays, Gentle Thursdays, and flowers and the like.
They did that here too?
Oh yes, oh yes. But the following year, SDS became a serious political organization. A group of people from various places around the country had come to the U, and we made a serious SDS chapter and started teach-ins and speak-outs and tabling and this and that. Started attacking the military recruiters and ROTC, and it was a very multi-issue. We ran people slates for student government, called for free birth control, dispensed at Hall Health Center. I don't know, we had an overall program. But what I want to get to is that feeling versus what we have now, where people are really, they have 1 foot in and 1 foot out much more. Then that was our community, that was it. If we were under attack, we felt our community is under attack, or we were promoting our community, going out and taking over more territory. I think since certainly the people that graduated, got families like myself, became a little bit more fearful maybe. We needed to keep our jobs and whatnot, so we became more tentative in our political activity. And I think on campus, students became much more committed to their student goals, to their degrees and what they were going to do afterwards, and to put it at risk for something that may or may not happen, they were less likely to do that. I think that's what you face now, is people who have 1 foot on each side. You can get them to come out and say, yes, I'm against the war, you know, yes, let's get rid of the sweatshops, but you can't get them necessarily to risk their future to try to achieve that. And there's some examples of how you, for instance, one thing that inspired me was the black contractors when they were trying to get a big piece of federal contracts. Tyree Scott was one of the leaders of that movement. They came out to the, was it the Red Square dig? Where, it was the Kane Hall. They came out and they drove a bulldozer into the pit, you know, dumped it in. Well, that showed they were serious, and they got their piece there. But you don't see that happening too much today. People hold back, and I work in the anti-war movement, and the anti-war movement really holds back. That we march around and around, and we let everybody know what we feel, but that's about as far as we go. So I think that's the challenge today. And I'd like also to describe my favorite event that happened. It wasn't the student strike, although that was great, especially when Bruce Olson turned the Daily over to the strike committee. That was just like, and Dean maybe can talk a little bit about that. He followed on from Bruce's shoes. But the Low Hall demonstration, where we were protesting the recruiters, I think from TWA, from the Navy, and some insurance company, Aetna or something, I think were there.
They're all the same.
It didn't matter. We had protested other people at Low Hall before. But at that time, the whole campus would turn out for these big SDS demonstrations. This was '69. So the people that were opposed to us, the counter demonstrators, came out. The people that were with us came out, and then everybody else came out to see what would happen. So the campus was just crowded. You could not walk. And we had Pat Friel, SDSer, a big shock of blonde hair, and we had the picket sticks were 2x2s. They weren't the wimpy ones. And you could see him at the head of the line trying to get through this crowd to get into Low Hall with his picket stick like this, just boom, 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 and the line of SDS just following behind him. And at that moment, as we were approaching Low Hall, a pickup truck full of beehives drives up. The beehives tip over mysteriously, the guy in a bee suit on the back, and everybody's getting stung by bees. We finally get in to Low Hall. The delegation goes up and confronts the recruiters and whatnot, and the rest of us are downstairs. The counter demonstrators are trying to get in to push us out, so they're shoving on the doors to try to get in, and we're shoving on the doors to keep them out. I had a friend who said later her feet did not touch the ground. She was carried back and forth in this sea of people trying to keep the doors, and we held the building. I'm pretty sure the recruiters didn't do much business that day. But that was a very heady experience to have the result of all this organizing, teach-ins, all this stuff, and then to be able to pull off an action like that with the entire campus turned out and to succeed was just amazing. As Pi was talking about SDS disintegrating, and so by the time the student strike happened, SDS was pretty much kaput. There were little groups of SDS all over the place doing different things, some in the SLF, some doing other things, but everybody, of course, got together for that big freeway demonstration and really did a good attempt at a strike. And I was just looking at my little files of stuff I looked at. There was an experimental 2 years later that followed directly out of the student strike because we formed a free university that had alternative classes and whatnot, and that led to the experimental college. And it's still going today, as far as I know. And I was reading in there, and Nick Licata was teaching a class, so. Thought that was interesting. I'm just as happy to leave the last minute for Dean here, so.
I spent many more than 4 years at this university, sitting up where you're sitting now. It took a long time going from class to class, but I never got to stand down here, so I want to stand like I'm a professor today, just sort of see what it feels like. I'm honored to be on this panel with Aaron and Larry and Oscar and Pi and Steve, but especially the old guys, because I get to be the young radical now since I'm younger than all those guys. I didn't come to campus until 1970, so I missed some of that fun. I came to campus and I wanted to be a sports writer. And I got a job at the Department of Sports Programs down at the Tubby Graves building as kind of an assistant to the sports information director. And I was doing the football programs and traveling with the football team and the basketball team. It was such, as a student, for a student job, it was way better than working in the photocopy center. It was great. I had keys to the stadium. Literally, I could go into the stadium and go in there and play by myself. So, and I loved this job because I wanted to be a sports writer. And so in the spring back then, and they might still do this, but back in those days, they had something called the Varsity Alumni football game. And this year's team would play graduates, and there were a lot of good graduates, so the games were always good. It was a lot of former pro ball players would come back and play against next year's champions. And it was a big deal for Seattle. Like, the football fans turned out. So I was working the game. And it was scheduled for May 13th, 1971. Anybody know what happened on May 8th, 1971? Richard Nixon mined Haiphong Harbor, the major port in North Vietnam. And it was chaos. People were sleeping on the steps of the courthouse, on the lawn of the federal courthouse. There were demonstrations on campus all over the country. There were big demonstrations. And I was doing the football program. And one of my colleagues there, a graduate student named Jack Pfeiffer, he and I were doing all this student work. And I came in on Tuesday after the mining, and Jack was talking to 2 or 3 of the football players. Sonny Sixkiller was the quarterback, was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Calvin Jones went on to play for the Denver Broncos, some serious athletes. And after they left, Jack said, "You're not going to believe this." I said, "What?" He said, "The football players are pissed, and they want to protest the mining of Haiphong Harbor Saturday at the game." And I said, "That's amazing." He said, "And guess what? They need us to help them." I said, "Okay, what do we have to do?" He said, "Well, they got to write a statement. We're helping them write the statement. And they want to stop the game in the middle of the game and make people listen to what they have to say." And I said, "That's incredible." And he said, "Here's the deal. They need somebody to go into the press box just before the second half starts and make the public address announcer read their statement." I said, "Great." Jack said, "I'm working in Pullman that day at a track meet, so you have to do it." And this is I really loved my job as a kid sports information guy. And so I'm stuck having to take this piece of paper. And so we get closer to Saturday, and the players get a little bit of cold feet, and they tone down their statement a bit. But they're still going to do it. And the head coach is a guy named Jim Owens. You probably have all heard his name. Legendary All-American at Oklahoma, played for Bud Wilkinson. Mean, tough, conservative, right-wing madman. And everybody loved him. And the players are scared to death that Owens is going to kill them if they do this, but they're resolved to do it. So I come into my job early Saturday morning to get ready for the game, and the place is completely tense, and I don't know what's going on. And one of the players says, "We had to tell J.O. that we're going to do this." And he hit the ceiling. He begged us not to. He told us we'd never play again. We're doing it. So, okay. So I walk out to the stadium. I go through the tunnel, and I'm standing on the sidelines. And I'm thinking nobody knows about this except Owens, but clearly not. The assistant sports information guy comes up and says, "I need to see a copy of the statement." And I'm thinking, if I lie and tell him I don't know what he's talking about, he'll fire me. So I give him the thing. He reads it. He says, "Okay, fine." So they play the first half. There's probably 40,000 people there, alums, students. I'm up in the press box. And the first half ends. They do the halftime thing. The players come back out, and that's my cue. I have to go into the PA booth and give the guy who's reading who's doing the play-by-play and say, "You have to read this." So I go in and I say, "Wendell, the football team wants you to read this." And Wendell picks up the statement and looks at it and says, "I'm not reading this." So I said, if you don't read it, they won't let the game continue. And I'm looking down at the field, and the co-captains are staring up at the press box like, okay, what's happening? I said, the game won't go on, Wendell, if you don't do this. So he reads this statement, finally. Ladies and gentlemen, may we have your attention for a very important announcement. The football team at the University of Washington wishes to take this moment to express its concern over the present situation in Vietnam. Toward this end, the team will now delay the game for a couple of minutes. Now, as Wendell's words echoed throughout the stadium, a huge cheer bubbles up from the student side. A few seconds later, huge, louder boos come out of the alumni side on the south side of the stadium. Boo! And this is pretty amazing because up until then, all the people on the alumni side, these were their heroes. Their heroes were saying, stop the war. Wendell continues. The players basically have one thing to say. They feel the war and the killing should end immediately. The team wishes you would take these few moments to think about what has happened in the world this week and what consequences they may have. Thank you. Cheering, screaming, booing. I'm like this. I'm just totally checking. The players did this. We didn't do this. This is the players. I'm just the functionary here. But I spoke, years later, I spoke with Reese Lindquist, who was the coach of the alumni team and a former Husky football player, coached football at Queen Anne High. Reese said that one of his players was Dave Kopay. Dave Kopay went on to play for the Redskins, St. Louis, San Francisco. He was tough. Reese said when he heard the alumni booing, Reese had to tackle him with both arms to keep Kopay from running into the stands and kicking the shit out of these people who are booing and hissing. So after this goes on, we let this go on for about 2 minutes. I said to Wendell, okay, you can read the rest of it. He says, the game will now resume. The team thanks you for your patience. So I was asked to tell this story today because I think it's important that we recognize that allies are everywhere. And that this may have been one of the best plays the football team ever did. I was really proud later to have been part of it. I was scared to death during it. Anyway, give a hand to the Husky football team. So I was asked to talk about a couple of different things. One was that, and the other was the role of the Daily on campus. I was elected editor in 1975, the same time that the Chicano faculty got fired, quit, and there was total chaos. It was an amazing time to be Daily editor. I don't know if it still works this way, but the editor is elected. And back then there were factions. There was a faction of people who wanted to be professional journalists and really believed that. And then there were 10 of us who wanted to be professional journalists and also wanted to have fun. I happened to win, and it polarized the staff. So half the staff, this 30 people were always yelling at us, we need to be more professional. And I remember being at a staff meeting one day and pounding on the table with my pica stick, which is an outdated thing that happened before digital type, and saying the problem with being professional is it's not good enough. We have to be better than that. And so for the next 3.5 months, we tried to be as good as we could be. It sounds fatuous, but the truth is, I actually counted it up. We had 63 articles that we would consider an investigative piece of journalism, including things like the hospital charging patients $10 an aspirin, but not just charging them $10 an aspirin, charging them for $10 an aspirin even when they didn't take them. They would charge them for the same aspirin each time for $10. There were dozens of stories with things like that happening. Corruption in arts and sciences, people fighting over money. The point is that at a place like the University of Washington, it's probably the third or fourth or fifth largest city in the state. There's a lot of stuff here to write about. Anybody from the Daily here? Great. All right. So we counted, the Greeks always hated us because we never wrote about them. You know, I mean, we tried, but there was so much happening. All this stuff was going on that they always never quite made it into the paper. And I remember in late spring, the day that Roberto Garfias resigned his faculty position from the School of Music, and there was a huge demonstration about the Chicano faculty. That was the day we decided to do a story about the Greeks, because they were doing this big thing up on Greek Row. So we'd sent Amy Hagopian up to write about what was going on Greek Row while everybody else was covering the true crisis about the faculty and the Chicano students. And so the next day, you opened the front page of the paper showed thousands of people filling Red Square and pictures of John Hogness with microphones in his face and all this chaos. You open the paper to page 3 and it said, meanwhile, back on Greek Row, and then it quoted one of the Greeks that Amy was interviewing, let's all get naked and fuck. So that was the dichotomy. And somebody asked me to tell that story. We did finally cover the Greeks. But the point of all this is that we found stories every day to write about that were real stories, that were corruption, that were injustice, and they came to us from other people. People would call us and say, this is happening in the English department, this is happening in chemistry, this is happening in the administration. People would call the paper and we would write about it. Every day, John Hogness would deny it, the administration would deny it. Sometimes the Seattle Times would ignore it, other times they would kind of refute it. They tried to, they refuted stories that we wrote about corruption at the university hospital. So this is all leading up to the punchline. When we were done, we had dinner. We invited John Hogness to come to my house for dinner. He was the president. And we made, there were about 10 of us, Brian Houghton, Steve Ludwig, no, not Steve Ludwig, Steve Militich. A lot of people there. We had dinner. We got Hogness really drunk. We made these drinks called Screaming Banshees. They were Galliano, tequila, Kahlua, banana liqueur, and whipping cream blended with ice. And he drank a lot of them, and we all got smashed. We all got sloshed. And we had a great time. We ended up really liking him. And he told us, you know, I had to deny all of those stories. I had to say they weren't true, but every one of them was true. And the point is, there's a message here. There's a lot of stuff to write about on campus. That year, we happened to have a particularly great crew. From that daily in 1975, people on that staff later on accounted for 9 Pulitzer Prizes. So I can attest that the reporting that was done back then was really good. And you can still do it because there's so much going on here that needs to be taken a look at. Anyway, that's what I was asked to talk about.
Was your question whether or not there was Native American student organizations that were active at that time? I mean, by 1969, the Native American students who had begun to come in here in some reasonable numbers in the fall of '68 did organize their own student organization, and they were very active around issues confronting the Indian community, particularly in '69 and '70 around Indian fishing rights off the campus and on the campus, the need for Native American Indian studies programs. And they were very active. What was the second group you asked about?
It was just about the Great Boycott and what that was like.
In the early 1970s, I know that, you know.
I can tell you this about the Great Boycott. I still don't eat grapes. For a long time, I didn't eat lettuce either.
There's
get as big a laugh. In case you don't know me.
Yeah. But the student groups on campus, as well as many people in the community, were very involved in picketing in front of Safeways and every other place that sold grapes for a couple of years. And a lot of students, led by MECHA, students organized those grape boycotts all over the community as part of the national movement to boycott grapes. When we had the sit-in of on May 20th, 1968, we thought that the governor of the state of Washington, Mr. Evans, Dan Evans, was going to be there because the previous year, on the last Friday of May, the governor came out and participated in the activities on the campus. He always did that at the end of the year. And our intelligence, which we learned was faulty, had indicated that he was going to be there. And our plan was to keep the governor and the president in the president's office until they conceded to our demands. Rather than the governor being there, and this is relevant to your question, the faculty senate, which in '68, this is definitely not going to surprise Pi, all 12 leaders of the faculty were men, and they were meeting with Dr. Odegaard, and I would say 4 of them ended up being crucial in pushing the president to sign off on the Black Student Union demands. And they made commitments like, we'll take it to the faculty senate, don't worry about them, and we'll get them. So yeah, there were some core faculty that were progressive and involved, and others that were resistant.
I think that the anti-war movement had a big impetus or a big outpouring of support and a lot of organizing on smaller campuses after the Chicago Convention of 1968, because that was the first time that we'd had a police riot, and it was shot on television with Walter Cronkite crying. And I remember I was working in the SDS national office at that time, and you know, one of the things that people kept saying was, my gosh, 100 people turned out in Missoula, Montana. you know, in Chicago, nobody knew what Missoula, Montana was, but that was something that really fed the movement. And SDS had, I'm telling you what I know, SDS had regional offices and regional travelers who once those groups sprang up, would go out there and help get them organizing. So that was one of the things. It was an outside event, but it was one that SDS was ready to piggyback on. And you know, I have to say that I'm too young to know any of the rest of it.
I'd like to just say one thing on that, which is one of the things that SDS always did here was there was always something going on. There were small targets as well as the big targets. So you hear about the freeway march and, you know, directed at the bigger national issues, but every week we were at the hub confronting military recruiters. You know, there was always targets that were really winnable. You know, we could chase the recruiter out of Low Hall, and we did. And so you had this progression from just the daily issues that would come up all the way up to the big ones. And there seems to be a tendency now to want to focus on a big issue and have a protest about a big issue, but you don't have the hook that's right here that you can really do something about. And I think that's the important thing, is to bring it right down locally, figure out what the university's into, and stop it right here and right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of changes that have happened in the last 40 years, but I think one of the crucial things that has happened is that in 1974, the corporate America and the government got together and decided that one of the things that they needed to do was push individualism. And that's when they really began to push it in 1970s, this whole idea of the individual, and that you have to strive to be, you know, wealthy, you have to strive to be this, and you have to, you know, do that, because our generation, that individualism didn't really exist. You know, we had a very strong cultural value system in every community, in the Latino community, African American community, the Russian community, the Italian community. We had a cultural value system that we cherished that said that the elders were most important elements of our community, that the youth were most important. When people went away to school, they went away with the idea of coming back to their community, whether they were a doctor, lawyer, whatever, and working in their community. And you also have to understand that many of the people in our generation, you know, we had very close relatives who were not far removed from slavery, and many of us were the first to go to school. We were the first to graduate from college. We were the first to enter into the corporate world, and when you had integration coming, you know, black people, people of color were able to integrate into the society and get very good jobs and really do well, and when they began to raise their kids, they gave their kids a lot of the things that they didn't have, and so you had this materialism thing that began to take place, and you had this individual thing that began to take place, and then in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and that was all she wrote.
I think the other thing that was an advantage to us that's not an advantage today is that the media then was better and less sophisticated.
Yes.
And today they're worse and more sophisticated at promoting the culture of the individual and ignoring people doing things unless they can use it in some way that is sexy or manipulative. And that's a big problem because we're even more media dominated now than we were then, but we don't have Walter Cronkite, you know, who's going to tell us that Vietnam is wrong. We just have a bunch of idiots.
Yeah. But you know, I want to add to that is that the 60s was, even though it wasn't 60 to 1969, it wasn't really much more than 10 years, which is a very short time for the amount of change that occurred. And so I guess what I would say to young activists today is you never know when things are going to take off. And if you just keep plugging away, you can have another one of those just all of a sudden flowering. I mean, it was heady to be active during those days. And when I looked back in preparation for this talk and I realized how short a time I was talking about, I was amazed.
I apologize, but I think we only have time for one more question before we have a student activist who sponsored the event give events. I actually had a question from Ian.
I just had a quick announcement for folks.
Actually, we're going to have space for announcements after this. That's all right.
Why don't you let that lady
not to cut you off, but yeah, please read.
I was wondering, are there actually any South or Southeast Asians on the campus, and what happened to them?
There were, in 1968-70, there were very few Southeast Asian students on the University of Washington campus, because it wasn't until about 1975 or the mid-70s that Vietnamese and Cambodians and others that had been caught up in this war and been victims or used began to come here in significant numbers. But there were a lot of Japanese and Chinese. That's why, and because not much progress was made on identifying Southeast Asians, Filipinos, Cambodians, and others. It's why in 69 or 70, I can't remember what year, the Asian Student Coalition on campus actually took over Dr. Odegaard's office and made the same kind of demands that we have, because I and Carl and Aaron and other people went with them to make that decision. We focused more on the Asian population groups that are low income and not adequately represented on campus, but Southeast Asians didn't come until after 75 and 78 moving forward.